Given that others have to leave early, it seems, and I think.
Oh, saying they're over here. Am I looking the right way? Yeah, look for them. So I'm looking the right way.
That's how I ended up department head as well.
Oh, well. But I'm not sure how, I think it's all.
Yeah, I think it has to be because there's not enough room
No.
to allow it, but on the one side. Okay.
Yeah, so who's not here? John's not.
Shen.
Sharon.
Gladys leaving early.
Mary Stewart's also going to leave.
Oh, you are, okay.
If we're all ready, I'd like to call to order the meeting for the Planning Commission, June 27th, 2024. The first item that we have on the agenda is an election for a temporary chairperson because we do not have the chair or vice chair with us this evening. So if we have any nominations for a temporary chair.
I nominate John Eastwood.
And I second.
Any further discussion? If no further discussion, all those in favor, please state so by saying aye.
Aye.
Any against?
Okay.
You're the chair.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we've been called to order. Next item on our agenda is the approval of the agenda. Everyone's had a chance to look at the agenda. Can I have a motion?
I move to approve the agenda as presented.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? So the agenda is approved and we move forward. Next item is the approval of the minutes from the meeting of June 13, 2024. Which everyone has had an opportunity to review. Any questions, concerns, or discussion about the minutes from June 13th meeting?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes from June 13th, was it?
Yes, that's right.
I second.
All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, thank you. So we've approved those minutes. Our next item is citizens' comments on matters not on the agenda. We're glad to see public here at this meeting. Are there any members of the public here who would like to make comments about items not on today's agenda? Seeing none, we'll close citizen comment for the moment. And we'll turn to new business. So the first item of new business, CUP 2024-04, an application by Tori and Joey Bates, owners of 313 South Jefferson Street, for an approval of a conditional use permit to convert a portion of their existing detached garage into an accessory dwelling unit to be addressed at 103 White Street. So Arnie, do you have a staff report to start this?
Indeed. As you pointed out, this is on the corner of White and Jefferson. And if you look at the location map on the bottom of the first page of your staff report, which is page 8 of your meeting packet, you see the house that faces onto South Jefferson Street, which is address is 313. And on the back side of that property, which faces onto White Street, and you see the little yellow star there to indicate the location of this particular structure. And over on the next page, on page 9, you'll see the view of that particular structure from White Street. You'll notice a 2-car garage. And as you go down the right-hand side, there is an entrance from the lower right-hand side, and that is the entrance into the living space in this structure that is being requested to receive a conditional use permit for a detached ADU. So it's a mixed building in the sense that it has a garage space and living space. And because the slope of the ground moves down, they were able to stack that living space as a 2-story towards the back. That's why you see the windows in a different configuration at the very rear of the building. And just to quickly go over, well, to spend some time with accessory dwelling units, because this is new. We just adopted this back in February. And this would be the first application for a conditional use permit for a detached accessory dwelling unit. You may recall that attached accessory dwelling units do not require a conditional use permit. But there's the first part of that definition. It is a complete independent dwelling unit with kitchen and bath designed and arranged, used, or intended for occupancy by no more than 2 persons for living purposes and meeting the standards of 11.1.1. And that section is the entire use and design standard section for accessory dwelling units. The building was designed in such a way that there was living space in the rear portion. And with the introduction of a full kitchen, in this case, that means a range. And I can't remember if the range is 18 inches or so, but there is a range now in that kitchen area. So therefore becomes a complete separate accessory dwelling unit or accessory dwelling unit that needs a conditional use permit. And that's why the applicant is requesting the CUP this evening. Going on down, I did not want to provide you the entire 3 or 4 or 5 pages of ADU requirements. So there's a link provided to those, but just to cover the ones that are pertinent here in the general standards. So I'm reading from the bottom of page 9. In C4 in particular, unless otherwise provided, the parcel must meet the minimum lot size requirements for single family residence in the zoning district. The parcel is approximately 13,500 square feet in size, which meets or actually exceeds the R1 minimum lot size of 8,000 square feet for a single family dwelling. I'm not going to go through each and every one of these in that way, but that was what was intended here. And you'll see my notes for all of them in italics. The owners do plan to reside in the principal dwelling or are residing in the principal dwelling. In number 9 on page 10, 9C, accessory dwelling units shall comply with the following parking requirements. So C states where more than 2 spaces exist prior to the issuance of the accessory dwelling permit, at least 2 spaces shall be maintained. Where there are currently 3 off-street parking spaces for the property, if you look at the photograph up front, you'll see a parking pad that can accommodate 3, not to even count the 2 that fit inside the garage. So they more than meet there. And then the little note that follows that, because we're in C9, C10 contains all the short-term rental rules and regulations. And I did not include all of those here. The applicant is fully aware that when they move, they have a current short-term rental registration for some space in the main house. And if they transfer that to the accessory dwelling unit, which is the intent here, they will have to meet all of those standards in C10. And they are aware of those. Section E talks about the accessory dwelling units for detached standards, and they more than meet the floor area requirements because this house is 5,500 square feet in size approximately, and the ADU is only 324. If my math is correct, that's less than 10%. And so it's nowhere close to exceeding 60% of the floor area. In E2, detached accessory dwelling building shall not exceed neither 25 feet nor 2 stories in height. Fortunately, when this structure was built, the maximum height is 24 feet, and that's at the rear elevation, because the rear elevation is where the land slopes down, and it's actually taller in the rear than it is on the front.
Yeah, Arnie, so do you normally measure at an entrance or at the largest point, highest point?
Definition in your code, I'm gonna paraphrase, says at the main entrance, not main entrance, says at the entrance point. So you measure at the entrance from ground level up to the tallest point of the roof.
Okay. And so if just say the entrance was where the garage doors are, then it would be 19 feet or whatever it was shown on the diagram.
And that's a good point. Let's say the entrance was on the short side of the building, and that's what we counted. And as it fell off, we ended up being at 31 feet. That would be perfectly fine based on the way we have a definition and measurement for measuring at the front door.
Okay, thanks. I was just wondering.
Yeah. Luckily, in this case, we're below what's the maximum is allowed. But then we also have an allowance because this structure was built before our rules and regulations that were adopted in February, but I'll get to that in a minute. Actually, I'll get to that next. In E3, any attached accessory building approved after February 1st containing accessory dwelling shall comply with the following setbacks. And then it goes into the R1 setbacks. But as I've noted there, the subject building containing the garage and living space requested to be an ADU was permitted in September 2023, which again is before we adopted these rules and regulations, and is therefore not required to meet the additional setback requirements of the subsection. Fortunately, they pulled the building back from the rear lot line. So the rear lot line, if you're looking at the structure from White Street is on the left-hand side.
Mhm.
They could have gone as close as 5 feet to that, but they pulled it back to a little bit more than 10 feet anyway, which isn't quite the 15 feet that we would have required for a new structure, but it's still better than the 5 feet that they could have placed that structure up closer to the back property line, again, which is on the left-hand side that faces that residence that's on White Street. Any questions about setbacks and why this particular property doesn't have to abide by the ones that we meticulously developed and adopted? And then in 5, they went through the historic preservation design guidelines and that were approved by the ARB back in July of 2023. And then in subsection 8 on page 11, detached non-conforming accessory dwelling buildings existing prior to February 1st, 2024 may be altered structurally or non-structurally. And so in subsection A there is no proposal to enlarge the structure. In B, the square footage of the proposed ADU is significantly less than that of the main building. And in the fenestration in C, all fenestration mechanical units are set back at least 10 feet from the property line. D, entry doors to the ADU are more than 10 feet from the property line. E, the overall building height is 24 feet and no height is proposed to be added. In F, this subsection specifically allows non-conforming buildings to be converted to an ADU in contrast to the requirements of the non-conforming section. So if you recall in the non-conforming section, if you have a non-conforming structure and there's a use in it, you're not supposed to go to another non-conforming use. So you're not supposed to change it to something else. But we had to specifically allow it to go to an accessory dwelling unit because that's what we were trying to accomplish in the ADU rules and regulations. So that's what F is trying to get at. So they are allowed to specifically ask for a conditional use permit to change the use if the building is not conforming to a dwelling unit. And then on page 12, I should stop there perhaps and ask if there are any questions specific to the requirements for this detached accessory dwelling unit.
I have just one. Are the mechanical units, are they on the very back of the garage? I didn't notice any from the road. Okay.
The applicant is nodding in the affirmative.
My question would be, clarify that a little bit more, please, for the non-conforming may be changed to the accessory dwelling unit. So is this?
The last one that I read,
Yeah.
8F. If you have a non-conforming structure or a non-conforming use, you're allowed to continue that non-conforming structure or use, but you're not supposed to enlarge it. You're
Mhm.
not supposed to do anything extra to the
Right.
structure or use. And you're not supposed to change it to another non-conforming use. So you have what you have,
I understand.
and you're supposed to only sort of whittle away at it and make it less impactful and not more impactful. So in the non-conforming section, it specifically says you are not allowed to change it to another non-conforming use. But we realized that somebody remembered that, or when we were going through the non-conforming section, said, hey, we need to make an exception to that. And that's what 8F is specifically. Yes, you're not allowed to change it to another non-conforming use, except for a dwelling unit, because that's what we're trying to accomplish in the ADU section.
Okay.
That makes sense? And if that's it then I'm going to go on to page 12, which is what you've always see for a conditional use permit. These are the criteria for the issuance of a CUP, and I won't go through those, but happy to answer any questions.
Right. Does anyone have any questions for Arnie?
Or maybe one last thing,
Yes.
if you don't mind. In the staff recommendation, we did come up with 2
Yeah.
conditions. This is a really small square footage, 320 some, if I remember correctly. So I
Yeah.
cannot imagine that the impact of this would be terribly great on the other single family dwellings that are in close proximity. And so therefore we have only recommended 2. You can certainly come up with more conditions. But the first one being that the size of the detached ADU shall not increase unless permitted by a revised conditional use permit. So if at some point in the future they want to add on additional square footage or take some square footage from the garage itself, they would have to come back here for a revision. And number two, the use of the detached ADU for short-term rental shall be subject to both the general standards of short-term rentals in that subsection stated there and the specific standards for short-term rentals in detached ADUs in C10. So just to clarify that if, and they do intend to have short-term rental in the accessory dwelling unit, that they would have to abide by those rules and regulations. And as an example, that one of those limits them to only 45 nights in a year because it happens to be in the detached, or actually I think that applied to both attached and detached, but there are further limitations on how many nights can be rented, just as an example, in an ADU.
Arnie, I have a question. How is it that this particular, I think you might have already explained it to me, but I still don't get, how is it that this particular building unit qualifies as non-conforming?
It was permitted back last summer, so that means it has standing, or it was already an approved building according to all of our codes that were available at the time, both building code, historic preservation. So it was already been approved and being constructed. And I'm not sure if it was even finished by February, but somewhere around there. So therefore, it is a building that existed and was approved according to the code that was available at the time. And then we developed the ADUs, which happened to require a conditional use permit for a detached accessory dwelling unit. So
All right,
because of,
I didn't understand the fact that it only had to have a permit and be started and not a finished product.
Yeah.
So I
that,
didn't,
there's I can't think of the phrase for it now, but they have not standing because that's legal terminology and I'll come up with it in a minute. But once you go through the permitting process, then you have the rights to construct that building. And as long as you start that building, then that's sort of your placeholder for what we're talking about now, and just as far as timing goes. And then we didn't come up with, or we didn't adopt, because we're certainly working on it, but we didn't adopt until February. So that means in several instances in our ADU code, it says specifically those constructed after February 1st have to follow this. And then we had the
Right.
non-conforming section, which we've already referenced.
do we have anything in the code that says it only has to have been permitted or having a permit prior to our date in February?
No, but that's fairly well established. And I'm even going to say, as far as case law goes, just because if a person goes through the permitting process and has, I'm not, again, I can't think of the actual terms, but they have established themselves, have put significant time, effort, and resources towards getting the permit. And they were most of the way through construction already
Yeah,
at that
I
point.
realize.
So they had the legal standing for having a structure under the code prior to us changing it for accessory dwelling units in particular.
Okay, thank you.
Arnie, not so much for consideration of the permit, but just out of curiosity, is it a one-bedroom unit then? And what's the layout roughly? Because it kind of ties in with our cottage housing, which I find
Very
interesting.
Thank you. So it's in three. So this is the lower level, which is really the foundation. This is the garage. And because it's a split thing, you walk in here, living space. Now I'm missing where my kid, oh, sorry, you actually walk in here, kitchen here, you go upstairs to a bedroom, one bedroom.
Okay.
So this is the garage. So because it's actually got three levels to it, sort of foundation and lower level. So you walk in, that's the photograph, you come down, you walk in, living space, little kitchenette thing here, stairs that go up and around without your bedroom.
Are there any other questions for Arnie before we ask for an applicant statement? Do we have an applicant statement? Would you like to speak? Thank you. Please come forward.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Hi, I'm Tori Bates. I don't have a specific presentation for you all tonight, just available for any questions if you have any you'd like to ask.
Thank you for being here. Does anyone have any questions for?
Tori, I was a little personally concerned about parking. And I did go over and, I only live around the corner from you.
Okay, very good.
And I went over and had a look and I didn't see that third parking space. I mean, I'm sure it's there. I just thought it was only the two in front of the garage. So I had a concern for parking because White Street is so blocked now. I mean, it's filled with cars most of the time, but you do have extra parking then for the renters or,
Yes, ma'am. We have the two inside the garage. The garage is very deep, as you see on the drawing. For our purposes, for renter purposes, but probably ours. We could even have two cars tandem inside the garage. It's that long. And then we can fit three on the parking pad in
All
front
right.
of the garage doors.
all
as
right, well,
well.
thank you. And I'm sorry I didn't see that the
Oh,
first
okay.
time when I walked over.
No problem. Thank you.
Might be helpful to look at page 18 that just shows the front parking pad that Tori just mentioned.
Yeah.
That is
See.
wide enough for three, in addition to what can fit inside the cavernous garage.
Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you very much for
Thank
being
you.
here. How about, are there any other members of the public that would like to make comment on this conditional use? Yes, please join us.
Arthur Barsenstein.
Yes.
My address is 614 Stonewall Street. I do own the 104 White Street, which is directly across from the Bates property.
Yes.
And I'm simply here to say that I don't have any concerns about this being an accessory dwelling unit. And just specifically to the parking, when I do reside at that property, I will have parking sufficient for ourselves at the back edge of the property. And so I'm not relying on the street front. And generally I find there is fairly, free parking there. So, if you have any questions for me, I'm happy to respond, but, I just wanted to get on record that I'm fine with, this proposal, and I'm on the ARB, and I think they did a very nice job of adjusting their plans to suit the ARB's preferences.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for joining us and sharing your views. Yes. Are there any other members of the public that would like to speak on this? Okay, then I'll close public comment for the time being, and we can open this up to commission discussion. Thoughts, questions?
Mine was the parking, but now I can see that they do have some additional off-street, so.
My question is, well, and this is just a sort of for clarification. How many of the neighbors are, or property owners, I guess would be a good way to describe it, are actually notified with a letter in the mail, Arnie?
All of the immediately adjacent property owners, irrespective of street. So we can just pretend like the street's not there. Arthur, as an example, is directly across the street. So any property that's directly adjacent to and across the street would get notified by a separate letter.
Mhm.
And then, of course, we also have the very pretty yellow sign that gets posted on the property. And then we also do the ad in the paper.
Yes. Leslie, did you have,
No, I was just gonna make a motion if that was all the comments.
anyone have anything else to add before Leslie makes a motion?
My other slight concern is just sort of, again, for the record, when we voted on all this and drew up the guidelines, it did seem like we were hoping to make more options for additional long-term housing for people as opposed to the short-term. And so short-term rentals. So, I want us to really examine that. And I'm wondering if maybe other members of the planning commission should be here to share their perspective.
I do think we put in enough safety nets as far as they can only use one, either their main property or this as the short-term rental. So I think to me, it doesn't increase the amount of short-term rental property.
Okay.
And in their situation, it sounds like they've already been using the main property, so it'll just go from there
Mhm.
to this. They can't do both properties as
Mhm.
short-term rental.
Mhm.
So I think we did put provisions to keep it from being a nuisance, because you're right. If you could if you could have, compounding it, if you could have it in both units, then it could become a nuisance. And they're limited to 45 days because they're in R1. So I feel like our short-term rental rules are pretty stringent as it is. We really don't get it very many complaints unless somebody's doing it wrong on occasion, and that's usually that correct me if I'm wrong, that they're not in the property, or that's not their primary residence in a residential area is the biggest issues.
Okay.
Any further thoughts on that topic?
I just didn't know if anybody else had, a sense that the other members of the commission who would be here, oftentimes Shannon has, a nice point of view to share, but
I'm not sure if you mean just on this particular one, or maybe we have a couple of these under our belt and then we do a little bit of a reassessment, sort of intent in what we are receiving as applications and that kind of thing. So maybe we can do a review at some point.
that makes sense.
Yeah, and I'll just warn you that, based on legislation that came up this past year and that is still being worked on, they're looking at not allowing us to limit short-term rentals in ADUs. That's been a push lately. Fortunately, the legislation, which had some other issues with it too, got put on hold and is in a study period right now with, I think, Virginia Housing. So it'll be interesting to see what comes from that too.
I just remember that our hope was for additional options for
Right, for housing.
long-term housing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Any other thoughts or comments on matters we'd like to discuss? Are you ready to make a motion?
Yeah. I think the proposed property looks great, and I'm pleased that that's our first accessory dwelling unit we can approve. So I move to approve conditional use permit CUP 2024-04 with the 2 staff recommended conditions.
Do I have a second to that motion? May I second as chair? Then I'll second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
So that motion is approved. And
John, can I just, before we go on to the next
Please,
topic?
yes.
So did you see any, through this process, did our ordinance look good so far, or the standards, I guess?
Nothing jumped out at me for this first one, if that's the question.
Yeah,
No.
that's the question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. So the next and second item of new business that we have, ZOA 2024-03 Annual Zoning Ordinance Amendments, Cottage Housing. We continue our discussion of cottage housing. Arnie, you have a staff report for us, right?
Yes, sir. On page 20, just to go down to the last item, what we're trying to accomplish this evening is to review the cottage housing proposal submitted by Max Ivankoff for his property at the corner of Houston and Walker Streets. As you may recall, a year and a half or so ago, Max submitted an application for doing exactly what we've picked up now, which is cottage housing. And that application wasn't quite complete, but he did have Arthur do a good bit of work, and that is what's been submitted. And so while we're now picking up this particular zoning text amendment, they have investigated and provided a proposal of sorts for what could happen on their property. So just take not for granted, just take into account that, as we're doing this now, this may look a little bit different, but that's just because that's based on their research at the time. And it doesn't look terribly much different, but I just put out that caveat. I'm not going to go over the first couple of pages, sort of the why pocket neighborhoods and why tiny homes, except to make one clarification. I think I may have said this before, but tiny homes for a lot of people are the thing that you see on TV where people put something on top of a trailer chassis and the wheels are still there. We don't allow that. A dwelling unit has to be tied to a permanent foundation. So I don't want you to think of tiny homes as the things that you see on home HGTV where they're putting something on a trailer that still has the wheels and the wheels never come off. Well, unless they drive too fast. So for us, it's still cottage housing, permanent foundation.
Yeah.
Or if it is something that's modular, that's fine too, because modular is allowed in the building code. That's a small sort of caveat. I'm gonna ask, unless you have any questions for me, I'm gonna ask that you flip over to page 26. The existing conditions map that Arthur and Max have provided to you. Just to get a little bit oriented we're on the corner of Houston and Walker Street. There was a house there, L-shaped outline or foundation that you see, and that is on a larger lot. So some of the detail here is there's one lot is a little bit larger, and there's a second lot as you go further down Walker Street.
Yeah.
And you'll see the little boundary line there. So we're talking about 2 lots in total. It's 0.7 acres according to this, and we're definitely in the R1 general residential zoning district.
Yeah.
And then there are several different concepts for you on the next few pages. I'm going to go through them quickly, but the applicants can certainly take more time to go through them if they want to sort of explain the hows and the whys. But on page 27, concept A, 10 units, 15 parking spaces. What you see here is pretty well what we've been discussing. Units that are sort of congregated or placed around common open area. Parking primarily is off to the side. There's a little bit of parking that's parallel on Walker Street. We haven't really seen that particular concept before, so that's a little bit noteworthy. 10 units, and then I'm just going to keep going through. You have a couple of cross sections or site sections on page 28 to kind of show how this would fall on or sit on the property. And then 29, that particular concept with 10 units. And what I thought was somewhat noteworthy here was this is obviously to scale, and you see other buildings in the area that aren't too terribly much larger for the most part. So it's not that much out of scale. Sure, you have more units closer together, but they're not that much smaller than many of the other units in the area. And 30, 31 just provides you some perspectives so that you can see what these would look like from the common area and also from the side along Houston Street. And please stop me if you have any questions.
What square footage are we talking about? roughly?
What square footage? In the range of?
What kind of basement?
Yeah.
Do you mind coming up and just so that people watching and for the record?
First of all, I think Arthur and his team did an outstanding job really exploring the concept. And the final several versions of that is what is presented to you tonight. As I'm sure you guys understand, sky's the limit, and it's very art speaking, trying to imitate reality, and this is what we are. We had some different ideas about the use of common space, its arrangement, what utility it provides to the city, to the public versus to the members of the cottage community itself. So all of those concepts are kind of, floating in the air, and it's really going to be, I guess, up to you guys to nail them down to see exactly what vision for cottage community is going to take shape in the city. So we approached the concept from different directions, and you'll see that one concept would be serving certain particular goals better than others, okay, and vice versa as you move to the next version.
Yeah.
Okay. That being all said, I believe our projected footprint was 18 wide by 30 feet deep for the actual footprint of the structure. which would include a loft area within the roof structure itself on top of the living space. And additional consideration was given to some sort of under-house storage, because storage becomes a real challenge in small confined living spaces. By the time you include the furniture, the kitchens, the bathrooms, we explored the concept of small footprints in the Thompson's Knoll community. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with that, but we did build a few very small footprint homes and made some conclusions based on that experience, that storage became one of the most important limitations of small space. And having that additional 200, 300, 400 square feet of just unused open space makes entire difference between living really well in small space versus being confined.
Yeah.
That's where we are right now. And of course, subject to the limitations of presence of bedrock, which we did find on site. Yada, yada, yada. So those items will have to be explored in greater detail once we get to construction. So,
Max, do you have any projected, I know this is probably way too soon, but like a price would be for one of these?
what, you tell me the right answer, I'll give it.
All right, can you tell me today approximately what the cost of building is
we just
per
don't-
square foot?
I mean, I
What
can
do you
tell you,
quote people that ask you to build a home today? It's not a super plush home, you know.
right, I hate to play devil's advocate, and I'll just give you an example I give everybody else. There's two cars, Honda and Mercedes, right? They do everything the same, and they get you to the same spaces in comfort, relative comfort, but the price points are very different, right? And then you have to quantify in your mind exactly, is the increase in price between, Mercedes and Honda justified? And a utility that you're getting out of that increased price, is it there? It's not for everybody. That's why Honda is very popular, right? So when we start talking pricing, we're really getting into this very esoteric, hypothetical discussion without having any idea of what the development cost of the lot is going to be. What kind of, excavation can vary from $100,000 to, $1 million in a heartbeat. So those unknowns have to be really nailed down first. Now, if you ask me, what would you project as a unit price for something in the community of that size, I can tell you that, affordability is really the driving factor in the development of this size, because you do want to provide housing to folks who are just, due to their income levels, are excluded from a traditional housing market, right? Without subjecting them to subsidy programs and labels and everything else that comes with it, right? So if you ask me for a range, it would be somewhere between $150,000 to $250,000. I know
Right,
it's a
yeah.
big, wide range,
Right, I realize.
but it's all subject to, right? We are talking that this needs to be a competitive product to offer folks utility that they wouldn't be able to purchase in existing market in the same zip code. So we are talking about limited square footage, but we still need to address storage. We need to address parking. We need to address stormwater, and all of those questions. I personally have not traveled that road before to do a development of that density on such a small footprint, where stormwater, drainage, all of that will come into place, because we are working with an existing property cluster. So don't hold me to it.
Oh, yeah, I promise. One other question, that approximately 400 square feet on the main, and then an additional whatever for a loft area.
Yes, so we've done 3 concepts in Thompson's Knoll that were based on 16 by, I believe, 32 footprint on the hillside that's overlooking the playground next to Little Burn Downing. And we felt like, we missed the 2 feet on the depth. 16 is just barely functional. 18 would be better, and that's what we dialed in into our footprint moving forward for cottage housing. It created for a relatively comfortable 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom arrangement within the 400 square feet. So including a kitchen. So
Like I said, the 400 doesn't include the
no, it
lot.
does not include a lot. So it's just the
Yeah.
footprint of
Yeah.
the postage stamp that you see on the plan.
Would it be fair to say this is highly conceptual at this point?
It is very highly conceptual
Yeah.
at this point because we'd like to see something like this, but what really actually is going to happen is up to you guys. I think we just wanted to kickstart the conversation 2 years ago
Yeah.
to approach and say, okay, well, this is an actual real project that's got some really tiny little salamander legs on it right now. So we can make this work, and this is what we think would work in this space.
That's really that's good. Very quickly, so we've sort of moved into public comment. Is your staff report complete, or
Can I
did you
just
have more
do
you wanted to
one more
say?
thing?
Yes, and I
then
want to make sure
allow-
that you're not cut off either. Yes, so, yes.
And if the applicant or if Max wants to go through further some of the design and or Arthur, they're certainly welcome to in the public part. But if I could, instead of making any more comments on design, because I'm not qualified, is to take you to the last page of the packet. Just to talk about some of the details. The main parcel is 0.56 acres in size. And if we divide that by the 8,000 square foot minimum lot size for R1 for a single family, that gets you about 3 lots there. Plus we have the extra lot that is already separate. So that equals about 4 lots and 4 single family dwellings. Typically we see a doubling of that in cottage housing. That's typical. It doesn't have to be exactly that. And then one thing that we have to be clear about, and I think this came up in our last discussion, is that we allow more than just single family homes in the R1. We also allow duplexes and accessory dwelling units and other things. So we have to be very clear when we decide what the extra calculation is going to be for for cottage housing, we're basing that on. All the other ones are basing it on the single family component.
Right.
So we have to be clear that it's going to be on the single family component. Then I think as Pat mentioned at the last meeting, well, we also allow duplexes. So that's 2 more. So we would be allowed to do 8 here. So then that brought up the question, do we want to incentivize cottage housing? So do we do 2.25 units per lot just to give a little bit of an incentive towards cottage housing as opposed to duplexes? Because we just happen to have that interesting little twist where our R1 allows you to have duplexes in addition to the single family. So that's what that sort of intent was on the back page, to give you some lot line dimensions, area calculations, and also how many lots you could potentially get out of the existing property.
Thank you.
We're still referring to those that would be the footprint. We're going to refer to those as lots then. Those individual little spaces, you're going to refer to those as lots.
Sorry, I'm not following.
Well, you said that,
No,
It-
conceptually,
mhm,
you could put 4 lots simply based on the area calculation.
mhm.
4 lots could
Right.
fit.
Right. But what we're trying to decide is if, and this is part of our drafting of our ordinance, whether will they be designated as lots in that subdivision
It's-
or in that cottage housing?
Here's, most of these are condoed. So you would end up getting a deed to something that says you own this footprint and maybe a little bit outside of the footprint potentially. And then you have common ownership of the common space, the parking and driveway and whatever else. So I think that's how it most likely will shake out. A condo type ownership instead of condos, stacked like you're
Mhm.
normally used to seeing. These are going to be sort of laid out horizontally.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Okay, so just procedurally here, so that we know where we are on the agenda, is that the conclusion of your staff report? And so then we're sort of back into public comment. Max, was there anything else?
Oh, can I ask Ernie
Of
one
course,
question on
certainly,
public,
yes.
on staff report? So did you see any differences between concept A and B and any pros and cons and?
Well, just to note, because again, we're still learning. So just to note, in the parking that is a long Walker Street,
Mhm.
If that's towards the calculation, is that something we would allow? Because technically that's not on the property. And there aren't any other locations in the city where we allow people to count on-street parking for off-street, but we don't know what our parking calculations are. We don't know how many units we have yet.
Right.
So just, that's a little bit different. In B, and I'm on page 33, the open space is now open-sided to the public.
Yep.
So that we've had them, for the most part, as I can recall, it's more internal. So they're more private space for internal. I'm not sure if this invites, and if you turn over to page 34, if I'm a passerby walking down Walker Street, and if that hedge isn't tall enough, and if there's no fence, all of a sudden, hey, that's a little open area for me and as the public to
Mhm.
walk into. So just defining space a little bit is maybe something to keep in mind. But those are the only comments. Oh, then we also had one of these had a duplex arrangement, and we talked a little bit about, do we want to allow duplexes? Do we not want to allow duplexes? It's just as far as the arrangement and layout of the units themselves. And then actually one last thing that I just remembered. We also don't have common building, so there's no common house. That's not a requirement, I don't think, but well, actually in 1 or 2, I think it was a requirement. Not just common area, open area, but also some common buildings. But that could be more of an amenity, doesn't have to be a required type thing. That is something that we don't see in these layouts.
And duplexes are though, in some of the, I can't remember the name of the architect. Did he have some duplexes in his?
One of our codes, and I can't remember which, had that semi-detached language,
Yeah.
and we couldn't
Oh,
figure out
yeah,
because
right,
it didn't
right.
have a definition to, and I can't remember if that was one of the codes that he wrote or not.
Okay.
Any other questions for Arnie? Okay, so now I'm closing the staff report. We're back in public comment. Max, thank you for, sorry to have it be, I've only done this. This is my second time doing this. So,
You're great.
yeah.
You're great.
Is there anything else that you'd like to tell us?
Well, I think I'm just going to be specific to this particular location.
Yeah.
And two elements that I'd like to mention to put it on your radar as you consider these proposals. Right. A is that it's a corner lot that allows for a very lengthy public street access.
Right.
Okay. That creates opportunities for geometrically stacking more units than twice the density of R1 district. Okay. So that's something to keep in mind because it allows access from multiple points where now you don't have to confine all the traffic to one spot, which typically is a limitation of a residential building site. It only has one access point to the public street. And as far as common space, we kind of differed with Arthur's team because I personally prefer having common area facing a very busy public streetway. It actually, I think, adds more street appeal and more public sort of appreciation for what this community really is. If you kind of have a small peek into it. When you stack the houses to have their own central common area, a number of houses going to be facing their backs to the public street, which I personally find less attractive than a common area facing the public space. So I understand from a conceptual standpoint, when those cottage communities are developed, they want to be self-contained. And I think the primary objective of that is to kind of downplay the density of how dense they are. And that's typically how you see them, not advertising it. Okay. However, in this particular example, being a corner street, being a high traffic area, this actually becomes an asset rather than a liability in my view, personally. So
Thank you very much.
that's it.
Can I ask Max a question since he is the applicant?
Please do.
That is a very good, interesting point. That's a good point on the open space. When you were putting these diagrams together, did you roughly calculate what the % open space is for both
That's an Arthur
concepts?
question. I'm not sure if we didn't have an
Okay.
objective number in mind. We can come up with something, but overall it's probably there is a ratio
Right,
of some sort because all the structures are the same size relatively
Right.
speaking. So the parking area did not change much amongst the concepts because again, it's really nicely tucked in for a nice, healthy 15 parking spot parking lot in there,
Uh-huh.
which I think would be a challenge to accommodate in any other geometrically shaped lot of this area. Okay, so, but to answer your question, no, I don't think we have a exact number of ratio.
Okay, even a rough one. If you come up with it, let us know, just because that's one of the things in a lot of the ordinances is they set a number, and I hate for it to be arbitrary. It's nice if we have a drawing and we can see this is
Sure.
40% open space, 30% open space.
And I'm sure we can answer that question
Yeah.
by the next meeting, just a simple calculation thing, so.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. May I ask a quick procedural question? So before I ask for further public comment, I know that we have a couple colleagues that need to go. Is there anything that I need to do procedurally to allow that to happen, or?
Fortunately, we're in a part where we're having a discussion. There's no decision to be
Right.
made with this. So if we have a couple of folks that need to make an exit, they can certainly do that and we can continue our discussion.
Good, and then we have access to the recording in the minutes, so people can follow up on any further public comment that's made, as well as any discussion that
We just won't be able to adjourn.
What's that? So I'm stuck here for 2 weeks, yeah. Okay, sounds good. All right, are there any other members of the public that would like to speak to these matters? Well, seeing none, we'll close. Well, is there any commission discussion is there anything we'd like to talk about today about these matters?
If I could just offer up what I'm planning on doing for next time, unless you
Yes.
direct me otherwise, is to start, and we've already started the format that you've seen before for other text amendments, where we have the first item is the intent section. So we give you the intent section that we're following from Winchester, and then we'll give you a couple other intent section examples, and then we'll discuss that, and then whatever the next element is. So we're starting to put that document together. So at the next meeting, we're going to get in sort of the meat and potatoes of each element and at least pinhole or start to put pins into what we think, and it'll be draft. So that's what the next step is.
Arnie, I know we touched on this before, but as Max was presenting, he said he's trying to make it affordable, which we need. How can we keep it from being rental properties, or can we keep it from being rental properties to keep it affordable housing?
We'll have
Or
to,
is it only the size that will make it affordable?
figure out, to see if we have the flexibility in our code to say that this is only going to be a for sale product. But then it's really going to be up to the HOA. So how's the HOA going to set up? Weatherburn, I think, and Max can correct me if I'm wrong. If you want to rent your property, not short term, if you just want to rent, you got a job somewhere else and you want to rent, you have to go in front of the HOA. And I think there's maybe a maximum percentage of units that can be. So I'm not sure how much we can dictate happens in the HOA, but that's kind of where it would be laid out.
Oh, sorry, do you mind? Sorry about that. Thanks.
So, I'll just add to what Arnie mentioned, specifically about Weatherburn. Weatherburn heavily relies on the covenant structure that every owner has to accept when they purchase the property there. And covenants restrict rentability of those units to a 6-month minimum. Okay, so if anybody wants to rent it, it'll be 6 months or more. And of course, then you have to disclose to the board, HOA board, which units are rentals, where the actual property owners live, contact information, and so forth. So what you're going to find is going to be a really fine balancing act between the private side enforcement of the community itself and what administratively a city government can do. And I think Arnie has a really good feeling on that as far as I think there is a potential for a test as well. So keep that in mind. It's like, can we limit rentability of a dwelling unit within our R1 district by an ordinance? I think no, if you ask me, because then you start getting into HUD housing rules and accessibility and so forth that I feel like regulated on state and federal level. So, but I'm not an attorney.
But but that's a good point. And so when Weatherburn, for instance, so those covenants were in place when people first bought in. So they'll
Right, the
kind of be up to
developer-
the homeowners once the first group moves in and they want it to remain a community, it'd be up to
Sure.
them to enforce those rules or keep those rules in
Right.
place.
That's our best,
Mhm.
example of self-governance and democracy without, involving a government.
Mhm.
So the community tends to really decide the extent to which they want to place a limitation. All right. So developer, when they came in, they adopted those covenants to be, attached to the land. And that was their baseline from which the sales were started. Now, as the community got populated and more folks get involved, there are different opinions about the original text, and there's a vehicle to modify that text
Mhm.
within the original covenants
Yeah.
by 2/3 of the vote and so forth. There is a mechanism built into those governing covenants to allow residents to amend all sections of that document. And I believe ever since we left, there's probably been at least maybe 2 covenant modifications,
Mhm.
which Arnie wouldn't know about, but I just know it's been brought up in annual meetings, certain things that the community felt was making their life easier. So
Okay, well, that's a good vehicle to,
I think maybe there is a requirement to have covenants or something, or a structure.
Yeah,
Mhm.
because something is going to have to go forward. And one's HOA, and I can't remember what the other one is, but it is an internal structure that we're not part of. So was the question to keep affordability, not allow short-term rentals or rentals?
rentals, no, short-term rentals more so, but yes.
I think we would have the ability, just as we said in ADUs, you can do short-term
Right.
rentals. We don't have to say that you can do
Yeah.
short-term rentals, I should say, in cottage housing.
Yeah.
Because it's already so small, so dense. I think you have some good justification for maybe, if you so decide, to not allow short-term rentals in cottage housing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also I guess my concern is we'll build these nice affordable houses and people will come up and buy them as investment properties and immediately jack up the price. And so really the only mechanism to keep that from happening is the original covenant set up by the developer. And if the property owners choose to keep that in place.
But even that wouldn't go towards market price for resale.
Mhm.
I'm going to use Weatherburn again. Prices have gone up in there, even with the homeowners association and whatever rules and regulations they have. It's just popular and the market's just gone up anyway. So just having the homeowners association alone in that type of organizational structure doesn't mean that they're not going to increase with the rest of the market.
Oh, right. No, that I understand. I'm just trying to keep them from being investment properties
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
more.
So zoning, we really don't do too much on the ownership side.
Right, right.
So, but the use side, such as the short-term rentals, yes.
Definitely an important set of questions, though.
Yeah,
for sure.
because it's gonna impact on whether the community supports this ordinance or not. If we are increasing density just to have it be investment income for people, the community's not going to support cottage housing. If it's going to be truly housing, and I guess when I say investment housing, kind of always look towards some of the college students and stuff, but we're looking for housing for people who want to live here long term. And there's not much we can do to it. So people are not going to give up allowing this extra density unless there's a compelling argument that this really will provide affordable housing for people who are going to live here. Does that make sense? Okay.
Right. I mean, but it's not going to be felt immediately. I mean, the splash effect may take a few years to get here, but I think, the argument would be that we, the city, are working very hard to increase housing stock.
Mhm.
Okay, which inevitably increases supply of housing within the zip code, which inevitably will lower the prices for the inventory that is out there. So it's a supply and demand argument in my mind, and we just really, if we approach it as such, because both markets, rental and property owner occupied properties, they're so intertwined.
Mhm.
And one does not go without the other, right?
Mm.
So we have shortage of rental property and we have a shortage of owner occupied property.
Mhm.
And that's why our median household price point is so high compared relatively to the area
Yeah.
because we just don't have enough supply. And I've done my part over the years to do what I can to increase that supply, but that's really going to be the only solution. If our supply is not keeping up with the people moving down here and demanding those historic homes and Main Street access and blah, 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 all those things. If we don't put out enough housing within the city limits, the prices will keep on growing.
Yeah.
That's just the reality of it. And this is one of the steps how to address that issue.
Yeah.
So.
Except if you're already a property owner, you're, you're not so worried about that. So again, it's just sort of, we have
Right,
to.
well, and then no matter what you propose, it's not
Right.
gonna work.
Uh-huh,
So,
right.
yeah. Right.
But yes, thank you very much for your comments and willingness to
Mm-hmm.
answer questions. It's helps us to
Mhm.
envision what could be possible. So thank you. Any further discussion?
The two of us.
I like your plan for next steps. You agree?
I
Yeah.
totally agree.
It'd be great to resume that with more of
But
a,
also just throw out, if there's anything else, we've provided 3 different examples of actual projects. We've gone through a couple of different codes. If there's anything else you need before we really get into sort of the meat and potatoes of each of the different elements, we're happy to do that if you just let us know what that might be.
I can't think of anything at the moment. I think you've laid it out very nicely for us over these weeks. So thank you. All right, so I'm closing that item. Other business, do we have a zoning and planning report?
Yes, and can I do one thing before then?
Certainly.
Sort of a point
Yeah.
of preference. I'm not sure if that's how the mayor always says it. But Krista Anderson is here.
Ah.
And she is our newly appointed planning commissioner, and Krista will start on the first meeting in August.
Great.
Just wanted to say welcome.
Yeah, welcome. We look forward to working with you. That's great. Glad to have you here.
And
Thank
for the
you.
zoning report, the region-wide housing study will be complete soon by the Central Shenandoah Planning District Commission. We've also just let a contract for the windshield survey. That was a CDBG planning grant where we're contracting with a company for them to come in and do an assessment from the street level of all the residential dwelling units in the city. And then we would have a nice sort of thematic map showing where the properties are that are in better condition, at least on the exterior than others. So that'll be extra data for us for the house that will go along with the housing study. That will be completed in about 7 months. So maybe first of the year, we'll have that housing conditions survey data. The Board of Zoning Appeals met a month ago, I believe it was. They denied a variance for signs in Weatherburn. BZA doesn't meet too terribly often, so I just wanted to mention that they did hold a meeting already once this year. City issued a demo permit for 114 McLaughlin Street, and you may have noticed that that building is already most of the way down on the ground, if not already down on the ground and carted off. We also expect another request for demolition from the VMI Foundation to demolish the house at the end of North Randolph Street. So 417 North Randolph, right? As you make the turn from North Randolph onto Dorman Street, if I remember correctly. And that will probably be happening soon because they're already into the asbestos abatement portion of that project. We also helped with 2 boundary line disputes recently. In one case, we assisted with pulling deeds to see who has access easements and that type of thing. Boundary line disputes are really civil between the two, but sometimes we get pulled in to sort of moderate or mediate a little bit. And we had to do that twice recently. Also, we received complaints of about 10 different properties, all within about a week, week and a half. All of a sudden, some of it was grass growing, but then when they saw because all of a sudden grass is growing, then they say, well, but the house needs to be addressed too, or cats are being fed there. So we're having to do a lot of code enforcement on the property maintenance side currently, just to make you aware of some of the other.
Did you say 10 complaints about one property
No,
or
about
10 properties?
10 different properties. So all of a sudden complaints have come in. And I think part of it's people are used to it, but then when the grass gets too tall, then that's sort of the straw. Then they complain about not just the yard, but the house as well. So we do have a number of properties to look at just to make you aware.
Are you the only one who goes out and looks at them or?
Oh, we have sort of a piecemeal process, to be quite honest. If it's building issues, then it's Steve and myself, Steve Falk, building official. He enforces some of the property maintenance standards, but then we have weeds that are in the special enforcement officer and the police department. And then some things are also public works related. So we sort of tag team the best we can. And that's all I have for a zoning report. Happy to answer any questions.
You have any?
Yep.
Nope. Okay, thank you very much. Should we check in about key annual planning commission milestones?
I have nothing to report there.
Do we have a city council report?
We met last Thursday, and one interesting fact was July 5th is the 250th anniversary of Thomas Jefferson's purchase of Natural Bridge. He was 41 years old when he purchased it, but more planning related items. One of the, we've had the request from Echelon Resources for the tax abatement for Spotswood property. And legally, we cannot give an abatement in this situation. And we looked at other ways we could partner with them to make this project proceed more quickly and could not come up with a solution. So at this point, they will not begin construction anytime soon. They do have until April of 2025 for both Spotswood and VDOT to begin construction, or else the properties come back to the city.
Mhm.
So hopefully the market improves, the interest rates come down, and building materials come down, but we'll see how that goes. In Lime Kiln Bridge, you probably heard, hopefully you heard on the radio or in the newsletter or in the paper that it's under repair this week, and it should be done by the end of the week. And that's all I have.
Thank you very much. All right, well then, our last item is to adjourn. I'll take a motion if you have one.
I move to adjourn.
I'll second that. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? None of us adjourned. Did I just